If you're a native English speaker, which means you're within one of the biggest video game audience segments, it is very likely you will never fully understand the 2005 game Pathologic by Russian developers from I Speak Lodge. This is not an insult. You might still enjoy and appreciate the game and like its themes, but it's not going to be truly comprehensible. And the reason is language. The language you speak from birth and how it has influenced your mindset and perception. Because the way you speak defines how you transmit and receive information, and that is inherently linked to the formation of your worldview itself. The English language, for all of its weird rules and their exceptions, for all its existing dialects and variations between countries, is concrete. It's structured. You have to say things a certain way for them to make sense. Because if you don't, not only it doesn't sound right, it's just plain wrong. You're making mistakes in your speech that you have to fix. The Russian language has rules, technically, but also you can do whatever the fuck you want and people will understand you and know what you mean. It won't really be a wrong way to say something, which means that if you're thinking in Russian language, the process itself is absolutely different to how an English-speaking person thinks. I present to you a pear. In Russian, it's called grusha. Now let's add another pear next to it. It's small. So in English, you say directly, it's a small pear. The word and the adjective. In Russian, there is a rule that allows you to add a diminutive suffix. Now you have grushka. Okay, sure, makes sense. But then, if you get an even smaller pear, you can call it grushichka. That word doesn't exist in the official Russian vocabulary, although it does in the closely related Ukrainian as far as I know. And yet, anyone will understand that it means a tiny little pear. And I have to use two concrete words in English to retain the same meaning. But we can go even smaller, even tinier, and add in Russian an adjective with a non-existent diminutive to have a malepusinkaya grushichka. And the best way I can transmit that in English is very cute, tiny little pear, and even then it's like it doesn't represent the exact feeling created by those words. And we can go the opposite way too. Now this huge pear is grushishe. There is no word grushishe in Russian, but anyone will understand that I'm talking about a huge freaking pear if I say it. And then when you put these words in a sentence, in Russian you can really do whatever the hell you want. If you want to say in English that this pear is yours, you have to say directly either this is my pear or this pear is mine. And there's two very distinct forms of the word mine depending on where in the sentence it is. In Russian, you can say "это груша моя," or you can say "это моя груша," or "моя это груша," or "груша это моя." It all has the exact same meaning, but each of those variations inherently comes with a distinct emotional layer depending on the order of the words. There's no rules about this. There is no textbook that says «моя эта груша» has some more aggressive or forward connotations than «это моя груша». It's just how you feel the language itself. Of course, Russian is not the only language to have this sort of specificity. I've already mentioned Ukrainian. I would assume that other Slavic languages have similar principles, and there are languages outside of the Slavic group to which what I said about Russian can be applied. And English itself has its own kinds of nuances that foreigners find difficult to understand. The only reason I'm singling out Russian in this entire comparison is because that's the language the developers of Pathologic spoke. And because of its specifics, that language is very chaotic. You can speak with non-existent words and understand each other. You can switch the positions of two words in a sentence to transform a compliment into an insult. You can do whatever you want with the language, and you won't be wrong about that. You can't do that in English. Can't take just words and places which for perfect people would understand. There has to be structure, there has to be a point. But how do you apply a point to a free-form stream of thoughts that is pathologic? You can't even apply the same meaning to the name. In Russian, the game is called more Utopia, which directly translates into pestilence, Utopia. But Utopia is not a subtitle. It's not an ironic statement in relation to the word pestilence. It's a genre. Wait, what? Who uses a genre name in brackets? Well, that question answers itself, doesn't it? And what kind of genre can a utopia be? Even though the word utopia is the same in both languages, it doesn't have the same meaning. In English, utopia means an imagined place or state of things where everything is perfect. In Russian, utopia means an unachievable dream. Technically describes the same thing, but in English the approach to the notion is optimistic, while in Russian it's wistful and pessimistic. It's an entirely different attitude. Pathologic is an inherently Russian game, but not because it's somehow steeped in Russian culture, society, or upbringing. In fact, I wouldn't really say there's anything distinctly Russian in Pathologic, culturally speaking. The game doesn't take place in Russia or anywhere for that matter. While there are a lot of Slavic-sounding names, there's also a lot of non-Slavic names, and in general the nationality of the participants is undefined, just like the time period, technological advancements, and even events that might feel like they have been inspired by something from Russian history could as well be applicable to other countries. There are allusions to politics and religion, but once again, nothing that is unique to Russia. So in that sense, the game is actually quite universal. What makes it feel so distinctly Russian to Russian-speaking players is not any of the surface elements. It's the Russian state of mind, the one that's linked to language. Pathologic revels in Russian language. Free, chaotic, creative. So clearly understandable, yet so difficult to understand with actual logic. You have to feel it everywhere. In more mechanical elements like the game's economy, in the world-building aspects like the town we're in, its history and even buildings, and of course, most importantly, in dialogues. Lots and lots of dialogues, which are as unhinged in their use of Russian language as is the language itself. Look, the game in terms of high concepts and mechanics is easily explained. You're in a town that gets ravaged by a plague, and you have a 12-day limit to try and save everyone while making sure to survive yourself. That's the gist of it, and all the important gameplay elements that are sensible for this type of context are included. Events happen in real time, there's a bunch of character stats you have to look after, various zones in the city get infected or quarantined as you progress, and you need to make sure to try not to get the disease yourself, and so on. All this is wrapped in a surreal story that's literally breaking the fourth wall from the get-go. The very first thing that you see is actually 3 playable characters arguing with each other on a theater stage before you choose one of them. Almost as soon as you start the game within a body of a character, you find cynically dressed masked people who talk to the player directly. Pathologic never hides its allusions to theater, which makes sense considering that it actually has started life as an interactive theatrical play, with real human beings involved. But that didn't really work out, so the play organizer Nikolai Dubrovsky decided to make a computer game instead, with 0 prior game development experience. To Nikolai's luck, his classmate from university had some connections and she organized a meeting with the Russian game publisher Buka, to which he brought an 86-page design document. But it wasn't really a design document, more like an impressive historical novel. It didn't really make clear what the game would be like. But the director of Buka would actually send it out to friends as he found it to be a good read, but wasn't sure about funding the project itself without Nikolai proving that he can actually make the game. So it was agreed that a demo version would be provided in half a year. Nikolai managed to find some like-minded people, including Ayrat Zakirov, who was studying to become a programmer, and work started on a self-funded prototype. 2/3 of the prototype funds came from Nikolai's dad. The rest, he won in poker. But I suppose there's no suspense involved, the demo was shown, contract with Buka signed, and so in 2002 Ice Peak Lodge was officially formed. But it didn't become a walk in the park from there. Pathologic was supposed to get released in a year and a half, Instead, it took twice the time and almost 4 times the budget. Practically every deadline was missed. The pace of development was obviously uneven, and Dibrovsky admitted to taking LSD around 4 times during production in the hopes of getting past creative blocks. But every time he would get disappointed that he couldn't see anything that wasn't in his head already. The scope of the game was too much, and eventually dire concessions had to be made. The written 500,000 words of text for the game had to be cut down to 120,000. 7 playable characters cut to 3. Full voice acting stopped being an option. The dream of what the game would be about was unachievable. A utopia. And suddenly, the Russian name of the game starts making a bit more sense, doesn't it? And still, you probably will be surprised to hear that a very big inspiration for Pathologic was an eroge called True Love, because it impeccably showed the feeling of irreversible passage of time, how childhood becomes a page in your book of life that has been turned forever. You're probably wondering, how in the world that's supposed to make sense? Anyway, I'm from Moldova, where Romanian is the state language, but due to historically being part of the USSR, I was actually raised in a Russian-speaking environment and didn't learn Romanian until I was 7 years old. As a result, when switching from language to language, I can always feel that influence from the first language I learned. Even then, I noticed that due to the mixed language environment, even Moldovans that, unlike me, speak Romanian from birth, don't use it the same way as people who were born in Romania. We're neighbors, we speak the same language. There's a popular song that participated in Eurovision about taking a train between our 2 capitals, Chișinău and Bucharest, to the point that it feels like you've traveled from one home to another home, and yet, because the way we speak is not exactly the same, the way we think is also not exactly the same. For Pathologic, the stream of thoughts governs over logic. The actual mechanics are irrelevant to its experience. Pathologic has character stats like hunger, exhaustion, and whatnot, and it's very stingy with how items positively influence those stats, but it doesn't want you to constantly feel like you're in a state of survival. Pathologic involves a lot of pretty slow walking, there's no running, in a setting that limits your time, but it doesn't want you to feel constantly stressed. Pathologic doesn't give you power, but it doesn't want to disempower you. Pathologic wants you to process everything. Developers describe Pathologic as a simulator of human behavior during an epidemic oriented at mechanisms of making correct decisions. And to make decisions you deem correct, you have to think. And to think, you have to feel and embrace the chaos, the creativity, the wonder, imagination, the impossible made possible, hope, everything. When Pathologic was released in the Russian-speaking countries, it won a lot of awards. But what is the actual reason for those awards? Let's check the explanation behind Pathologic winning one of the Game of the Year nominations. A game that's a drama, a game that's theater. Regardless of freedom of choice and actions, a tragic play is unfolding around the player, where every human is an actor, location, a decoration, and every little detail a symbol with multiple meanings. Every new day turns the seemingly clear understanding of the world upside down. New facts make you take another look at your heroes, and from the depths of history the outlines of distant events float up. Sometimes these echoes explain what is happening today, help to predict what to wait for tomorrow. And every time there is a choice, who to save and who to sacrifice, who gets to live and who's fated to die, which are the 2 greatest miracles to destroy, or can both be saved? At what cost? The farther you go, the more difficult it gets to answer questions, because there are no right answers. Notice how this text doesn't focus on aspects that many English-speaking outlets and critics and players talk about when discussing Pathologic. The bleakness, the constant dread, the lack of power, the difficulty to survive. Sure, the tragic state of events of course is mentioned and is relevant, but the focus is on information, knowledge, questions, and how to answer them. In English-speaking space, a moment that's often mentioned as being the defining part of Pathologic is the second day, when prices go up and it's practically impossible to buy anything. It seemingly goes to show how uncaring, evil, and outright devious the game is. This second day is used as a shining example of how smart, creative, and brave is Pathologic's subversion of in-game economy. Here's an excerpt from a 2005 Russian review of Pathologic. I wouldn't say that Pathologic revolutionizes in-game economy. You might ask, how much does the meat cost in a store? And I will ask you in return, on what day? And we'll be absolutely right, mind you. News about an epidemic obviously leads to astronomical price increases in the first days, and then the boom dies down and prices with it. This particular part is not strictly language related, there is a bit of a cultural aspect as well. What is shocking for players from one chunk of the world is obvious for players from another one. And I remember when I played Pathologic for the first time myself, I was 14 years old at the time in 2005, I wasn't shocked by the second day. In fact, I was actually greatly benefiting from it. Because in the first day I was spending money on anything I could find, since why wouldn't I? I had the money and obviously will need those products. And then when the prices greatly hiked, I could easily get pretty rich while still having enough items left for myself. The often seen in English-speaking spaces story of having to sell a pistol in last-ditch attempts to survive is not something I have ever experienced myself in Pathologic. The price increase itself wasn't shocking, it was normal, really. But I'm a child of a post-Soviet country. And in the 90s, all post-Soviet countries went through absolutely unstable stages, not just in terms of prices and currency and inflation, but everything. Some of my most vivid childhood memories are related to regular electricity shutdowns we had. Every week or so, entire parts of the city would be left without electricity for a day or two, and when it would turn on for us, other parts of the city would have their electricity shut down for the purposes of saving as much as possible. That was just the way it was for years. It was the normal that we accepted. And so, in the game, when prices would increase, the reaction would be, yeah, that makes sense. I think what's most telling though is how differently Russian-speaking and English-speaking players describe Pathologic in mechanical terms. Russian players tend to call Pathologic a mix of a classic adventure and role-playing game, the adventure genre being called quests, as Sierra's games that had quests in their names were extremely popular, so that's how the genre got its moniker. Russian-speaking regions developed their video game culture separately from many other countries, so the adventure genre didn't exist. In fact, even if you go to Russian Wikipedia nowadays, you will find that the game lists quest, meaning a classic adventure game, as the first and most important genre, then role-playing, and survival is third, at the end. So Pathologic is about going around and talking to people and trying to solve problems. Avoiding death is just additional spice. On English Wikipedia, survival comes first. In fact, many call the game survival horror, which is a term the developers categorically disagreed with. And of course, there were the discussions whether Pathologic is fun and should games in general be fun. A discussion that to me is absolutely alien, ever since I found out about it after deciding to learn game design and entering more English-speaking online communities. Here's the thing. There is no word in Russian that is equivalent to the English fun. The official translation of the word fun is веселье, but its meaning is more of being funny or happy. And веселье or веселый is never really used to describe games unless they're a comedy or something really lighthearted. And even then, not really. There are other more sensible for that words like смешной for funny and яркий or добрый for something that makes you feel really nice. A pretty close word to fun is удовольствие, which means pleasure. Sometimes it is used in relation to games, like playing them brings pleasure, but that's rare. The adjectives related to good games are more about if it's интересное, meaning interesting, or захватывающее, meaning engrossing, or увлекательное, meaning engaging. And while fun can certainly mean all those things, it's not the only meaning the word has, So if a game is fun in the connotation that English-speaking people have, is beyond the comprehension of Russian language. There, it's not a question whether a game is fun, it's a question whether a game is interesting, engrossing, or engaging. And it's a perfect opportunity to talk about the English translation. Pathologic Classic HD, released in 2015, has fully revised its English localization in comparison to the original international release in 2006. The main reason being, well, pretty much everyone complained it's a really bad, totally botched translation that's confusing and incomprehensible. It is undeniable that the original English translation of Pathologic had issues, mainly relating to how it didn't actually have parts of some texts, which in a few cases could downright make the means to progress unclear. But in terms of the actual translation, I find the feedback about it being incomprehensible pretty ironic. You see, when comparing the texts of the two English translations with the Russian original, it is exceptionally clear that the original English translation wanted to be as close to the Russian text and its meaning as possible, which also means trying to preserve unclear or double meaning. Confusion and the act of trying to understand what you just talked about are part of what has made Pathologic so beloved in Russian-speaking regions. That's why the walk-in segments are so important. They give you time to think and process everything. And there's a lot you need to process. For the sake of example, let's take a look at the end of one dialogue close to the beginning of the game. In the revised English translation, our companion mentions that everything that's happening is happening on our account. And there's really no two ways about it. The language is flowery, but it's clear that whatever happens will benefit our goal in some way. Which in the original Russian version is one of the meanings you can get out of that sentence. The other is that everything has been set up specifically because of our arrival, so we would participate in the events. And this double meaning is better represented with a more literal translation in the first English version, where we're told everything is happening for us. It sounds weird and it's not clear exactly what that's supposed to mean, which, well, yeah, that's exactly the point. Go and think about it. Now extrapolate this from a single dialogue line to the entire game. Basically, the way to look at it is, in Russian the language used is both flowery and the wording often has uncertain meaning. In the first English translation, the intent to try and save as many multiple meanings as possible has led to texts that in the context of the English language are not flowery at all and can be outright complicated or confusing. In the revised translation, the text is flowery and feels much better for an English-speaking person, but it loses some of its depth. Things are still mysterious, but also a lot of details are more on the surface and not that up to interpretation. This is why language matters. The experience of playing Pathologic Classic HD in English doesn't really represent the feelings that Russian-speaking players get. When you're less confused and dialogues are more straightforward and easier to understand, you spend time focusing on the mechanical aspects of the game. How to survive, where to find food, why you're still walking, how the hell to manage to win in the unruly combat system. And look, it is true that the game is specifically made to avoid combat. But also, if you embrace the chaos of the mechanics just like you'd embrace the chaos of the Russian language, fighting doesn't feel that grueling. It just really depends on what you're trying to focus on. By the way, I don't want you to think that Pathologic was unanimously beloved in Russian-speaking countries. Not everyone liked it. There actually was a popular outlet called Igromania that gave it a 5 out of 10 and received a barrage of angry fan forum posts and emails. The journalists had to release a statement where they stand by their score but acknowledge how impactful the game was for many people. And one of the biggest stated reasons behind that score was lack of clarity. That you're going from dialogue to dialogue that are just large streams of consciousness. Yeah, not even every Russian-speaking person can take the pure representation of chaos and freedom of their language. And that's fine, indeed it just is such a strong concentration, but that's what makes the game special. This is why I'm so adamantly avoiding discussing mechanics in detail or plot twists and whatnot, which are mind-boggling, but also in a way totally make sense because the game really has been telling you about them from the beginning. You'd think it would have importance for the premise of this entire video, especially for people who have no idea what Pathologic is. I've started with a very strong statement about how if you're a native English speaker, you will never truly comprehend Pathologic. Went on a tirade explaining why you won't comprehend it, and then never actually answered what Pathologic is to help you understand it. Differences between languages and inferred mindsets, varying focus on game mechanics between regions of the world, a Moldovan song about brotherhood with Romania, examination of why a bad translation is good, and eroge, what all of it was for, what does it all mean? Exactly. If you've been listening to me all this time and have feelings about it and questions, and are wondering what is the answer to those questions, then congratulations. You understand Pathologic.